Hello and welcome to my presentation. My name is William Costello and I just thought I'd jump on and give a little face-to-face introduction to my talk this evening, which is Step Your Dick Up, Why Incels Deserve Better Advice. So I'll just give a little background to myself before moving into the PowerPoint version of the presentation. So my name is William Costello, and a little bit of background about myself is that I moved to England from Ireland in 2011 for my undergraduate degree in English and education. I followed this up with a postgraduate degree in career guidance before spending the last 5 years developing career guidance software for students to use in schools to help them plan their career decisions. My most recent turn is to return to university to study evolutionary psychology at Brunel University, London, and I started 2 weeks ago. So far, so good. How did I come to get interested in evolutionary psychology? Well, looking back, my university career actually took strange segues towards evolutionary psychology without actually even realizing it. For example, during my English degree, I did an erotic writing module for a creative writing module, and this led me to read The Evolution of Desire by evolutionary psychologist David Buss, and I just found the whole thing fascinating. So I was making links towards evolutionary psychology already in that sense. My dissertation for my undergraduate degree also happened to be a literary defense of the work of Tucker Max. Tucker Max was quite a controversial author, and I defended his literature against the accusations of rape culture. Tucker Max went on to found the podcast called The Mating Grounds. And The Mating Grounds was a podcast he did with Dr. Jeffrey Miller, another evolutionary psychologist, and it attempted to bring evolutionary psychology into the mainstream. The reason why I'm going back to university now is because during my commute to and from work, I turned my car into a little mobile university, and every podcast, audiobook, everything I was listening to seemed to gravitate back towards evolutionary psychology. So I decided the time is right to go back and start my studies, which is what I'm doing now at Brunel. My long-term goal is to continue on to a PhD and eventually fulfill my long-term goal of working in higher education. In my spare time, I also write opinion pieces on various topics like identity politics, gender politics, a range of different cultural issues. And one of the pieces that I wrote over the summer that got me a lot of traction was this piece about incels, which is what the presentation is about today. The title of that was quite provocatively, Step Your Dick Up, Why Incels Deserve Better Advice. Since publishing the piece, which was published with A Voice for Men, it's been positively received by incels, normies, and even some feminists alike. So that means I'm either doing something really good or really wrong. And hopefully by the end of the presentation today, you'll think that I've done something really good. So I'll move on to the PowerPoint part of the presentation now. Thank you. So, what or who are the incels? We hear a lot about double standards between female and male sexual behavior. Women who have a lot of sex are often slut-shamed, while men who have lots of sex are seen as studs. What is often ignored, however, is how true the exact inverse of this is. Men who cannot get sex are seen as losers and are lampooned as members of the most derided group in society, incels. Meanwhile, perpetually single women are celebrated in society, and we lament the lack of good men out there. Examples of this include the 2019 Psychology Today article, Are There Not Enough Men Worth Marrying? And the New York Post article, Broke Men Are Hurting American Women's Marriage Prospects. Not to mention the media love-in for self-partnered Emma Watson. An incel, or involuntary celibate, is defined as someone who has not had or cannot gain access to sex for a sustained period. Going by this definition, and acknowledging the fact that the number of men who are not having sex within the last year has increased threefold in the last decade, we must conclude that the majority of incels are peaceful and non-violent. A significant minority of incels derive a sense of community, spitting misogynistic vitriol online, and rare individual cases of incels have lashed out at society in horrific acts of violent rage. Media and cultural depiction tends to fixate on the latter two groups and uses them to represent all incels as misogynistic terrorists in waiting. I'm reminded of the moral panic about incel violence around the Joker movie that just didn't manifest whatsoever, despite the media salivating at the prospect. It is important to note that while they may resent their lack of success in what they consider a somewhat superficial sexual selection system, the majority of incels do not necessarily hate women. The majority might not even define themselves as incels. I care about incels because I feel they are very misrepresented due to the most extreme voices within their community. We quite rightly rail against other minority groups being defined by extremists within their community, for example, the harmful stereotype of Muslims as terrorists. However, we are reluctant to do this when regarding incels. Perhaps there isn't much sympathy for this group because they are seen as white and conservative, which isn't really true. The incelosphere is far more diverse, and this is something that I hope to study further in my research. I have also considered that a way to get more sympathy in this identity politics, oppression Olympics world might be to change the public perception around that demography of the incelosphere. In society, we usually try to help or at least have sympathy for the most disenfranchised minority groups, but we don't seem to do this when we discuss incels. In response to my article, I have seen people who are usually extremely kind commentators say things like, "Life is hard, get over it." I think this is a disservice to the vast majority of incels who do not meet the trivialized caricature description used by most media. This doesn't help the problems incels face and represent in society. In my piece, I mentioned the work of fellow speaker today, Tanya Reynolds, at the University of New Mexico. She has done amazing work on how we morally typecast men and women, and that there's evidence to show that we value male pain less. I feel that the pain of inceldom is downplayed by society, despite studies showing that physical pain and social pain, i.e. rejection, exclusion, ostracism, activate the same regions of the brain. Modern-day progressives will happily tell you that words are violence, but this will most likely scoff at the notion of this type of pain. I feel that this dismissiveness is due to how acutely aimed at men most sexual rejection is, and an example of an empathy gap. The reason my female friends can scoff at this type of pain is because they genuinely can't relate to it. Many of my female friends have literally never been rejected. They live in a state of sexual abundance of options. Blissfully ignorant state of abundance. Something that's very significant is that with the focus on the shitposting and misogynistic vitriol in these online communities, what gets lost along the way are the signs of suicidality and depression. It is my opinion that sadly the incelosphere is full of potential suicides in waiting rather than would-be terrorist attacks. Step your dick up, the futility of advice given to incels. In discussions about this topic with friends, one of the cruelest and most galling pieces of advice that I have heard put to incels is that they should step their dick up, i.e. improve themselves to a standard at which women will consider them. If we can move past the glaring double standard and the fact that an unlucky in love woman would never be told to step her pussy up to earn male attention, how much do we really think can be mitigated through self-improvement? My article was about trying to find that sweet spot between what can be mitigated, improved upon, and ultimately overcome for an incel. There is obviously no objective answer to this, but we can grapple with the question. Some elements are impossible to overcome and are immutable, like height, for example, which my article details is a significant deal breaker for many women, unfortunately for me. The first incel I have ever encountered in real life spoke at the Messages for Men conference I attended in London in 2019. At which I did not see any sign of acclaimed feminist author Laura Bates, who maintains she was in attendance. Richard, the incel who spoke, overcame obvious crippling anxiety to speak and provide insight into his life. The most striking point for me was how he detailed a frustration at the tension between being told to simply be yourself and just lift bro in order to improve himself by weightlifting. Just lift, bro, I was told, is a common piece of magic bullet-style advice provided to incels, particularly from men within the wider manosphere. It seems cruelly insufficient when we consider the number of barriers or the number of incels who report to have physical or mental disabilities which might serve as significant barriers to weightlifting. Meanwhile, telling an incel to simply be himself is to gaslight him into thinking there is no problem at all, or to imply that his problem is that he's being inauthentic. The blaseness and dismissiveness with which incels are told to just live, bro, is demeaning to the significance and complexity of the challenges they face. It's not all about looks. People say it's not all about looks, but to make the argument that it's not all about looks is to make the assumption that if you don't have good looks, you can simply compensate with a sparkling personality. I'm routinely provided with anecdotal evidence for such a phenomenon. However, what constitutes a sparkling personality can be very much dependent on what the man looks like in the first place, and there is often a minimum level of attractiveness to be reached before personality and other traits are even considered. Feminist writer Louise Perry had this to say on the looks versus personality dichotomy. The dating market is highly competitive, hierarchical, and often cruel. This fact is uncomfortable for anyone who values egalitarianism, so a more appealing, albeit dishonest, option is to blame incels for their plight by suggesting that their unpleasant personalities must be the problem. Social skills to some extent can be learned, primarily by overcoming shyness to reveal a truly interesting personality. This does require a putting yourself out there that can be grueling for socially anxious young men, and a trial and error learning curve that will lead to all sorts of discomfort for women who will have to endure many inept attempts at approaching them. Many incels lack the basic social skills required to navigate relations with the opposite sex. According to an internal poll carried out on the website incels.co, 26% of users of the forum said that they had some form of autism. Flirting, which requires an innate understanding of nuanced subcommunications and unspoken sexual tensions, does not come naturally to these men. It seems that it's difficult for us to imagine a man who is objectively lacking in every aspect that might be important to a woman when considering a mate. We also neglect to acknowledge how many of these are immutable and difficult or impossible to do anything about. Take, for example, the issue of height. Research from the online dating website AYE.com found that every inch increase in a man's height directly correlated to his likelihood of being contacted by a woman. The study showed that 6-foot men were 33% more likely to be contacted than a man of average height, and 77% more likely to be contacted than a man under 5 foot 4 inches. A different study about height and human mate choice found that on average, the shortest man a woman would date is 5 feet 9 inches tall, 2 inches taller than the average man. And the same study shows that 23% of men, compared to only 4% of women, would accept a dating relationship where the woman was taller. The average woman is 5 foot 3 inches. Why do we insist that men must persist in a world where 90% of romantic advances are expected to be made by men? Why do we want them to continue to run this gauntlet? Why do we want them to continuously pick themselves up and try again, only to endure humiliating rejection after each clumsy attempt? In a world with antiquated views about who should pay on a first date, how much money should a man have to spend fruitlessly on courtship before it's okay to stop? The notion that there's someone out there for everyone also seems oddly sexist towards women. If you just keep looking, there'll be a woman with low enough standards for you. What do we as a society get out of this ritual that causes so much pain? It has crossed my mind that many incels take such comfort from the identity and community aspect of inceldom that they would almost be reluctant to change. We need to give them a better choice to choose. Why would they choose the ritualistically humiliating, exhausting, and expensive gauntlet that is the dating market over a powerful community that gives them a real or perceived grievance, fraternity, and sense of identity? The next part of my presentation is about the ways in which our evolutionary psychology is in tension with certain aspects of modernity. The real problem of humanity is the following. We have Paleolithic emotions, medieval institutions, and godlike technology. Edward O. Wilson. It's the dating economy, stupid. Every time I discuss incels with any semblance of sympathy, I am met with a chorus of boo-hoo, woe is me, poor men, they're not entitled to sex or women, you know. This is of course true. I am not and have never at any point suggested that women should be made lower their standards to reduce the plight of the incel. However, the erosion of societally enforced monogamy, coupled with the fact that women are rapidly outpacing men in education, yet still seeking highly educated partners, has significantly exacerbated matters on this front. However, to have sympathy for incels does not equate to advocating women be given to them as their entitlement. However, I do want to discuss hypergamy and female sexual selection reward systems. Hypergamy is the idea that women tend to marry equal or higher earners than themselves. This is true cross-culturally. They make far better mating decisions than men due to the greater parental investment. They have a lot more to lose by choosing the wrong man. We men are pretty simple creatures in my book. We tend to follow the female reward system. And it's female sexual selection that has helped shape men's behavior more than anything. I often joke to my female friends that if they want different behavior, they should just start rewarding different things. A recent study by an academic called Joanna Pepin, who's conducting research on what young people really want from their relationships, found that just 5% of women said they would like a relationship with a man who works part-time or doesn't work while they worked full-time. We've done a fine job of bringing women into the workplace, but we haven't really brought men into the home more. And this isn't because men don't love their kids and families, it's because for centuries men showed love by being away from their families at work while the woman was at home raising the child. This led to resentment because each has what the other wants. This leads to a problem because now there literally aren't enough good men out there if we're to go by women's own modern romantic standard. This mismatch has traditionally been solved by societally enforced monogamy, but that has eroded over the last number of years. It is an uncomfortable truth that women no longer feel that they need to settle for a man that they don't want. And why should they? However, it does lead us to the problem of more and more men not being selected for and eventually to the incel problem. If we consider the two big predictors of meaning or a mentally well life for men, having a wife and having a job, in the past, men were guaranteed both of these pretty much because of societally enforced monogamy and the fact that most jobs were physical. We've made a switch from a brain-based economy rather than a brawn-based economy, and female emancipation into the workplace means that women are competing with men for the same jobs but wanting to marry equal or higher than themselves. This wouldn't be a problem if women were more comfortable in rewarding full-time fathers in their sexual selection. Now, we can frame this as, oh, fragile men and their egos, but they really are threatened because they have a lot to lose. And of course, I'm not advocating that men are entitled to women. I make that very clear in my article. However, I don't think any of this is good news for women either, because it means there are less and less men that they actually want to choose from. Incels could become the new Vikings. Another way in which inceldom was mitigated against historically was by aggressive colonialism, which obviously doesn't happen in the same way anymore. Single men used to be collected up and sent raiding in other countries, killing other men and taking wives for themselves. There's a great article pictured here by Mary Harrington that talks about incels becoming the new Viking. Tindernomics. The dating economy is increasingly moving online, and a recent study of Tinder found that the bottom 80% of men, in terms of attractiveness, are competing for the bottom 22% of women, and the top 78% of women are competing for the top 20% of men. Crudely put, the modern dating economy closer resembles polygyny, with the most high-status men having a monopoly on the majority of women. The majority of men are simply not being considered. I also recently came across a really sad piece of information the other day about Tinder using a social credit type system to determine which profiles are even shown in the first place. So, if you're not being chosen, the more it will lead to you not even being shown, and it's a race to the bottom. It reminds me of the biblical quote, "For to the one who has, more will be given, and he will have an abundance. But from the one who has not, even what he has will be taken away." Matthew 13:12. Incels have taken the decision to check out of a mating market in which they see the cost of courtship as being too high, both financially and emotionally. They are increasingly retreating to virtual worlds of pornography and online communities as shelter from what they see as a culture that rejects them. Consider the popularity of sites like OnlyFans. This is also an example of sex being used as a commodity and weaponizing men's sexual desire alongside women's craving for social media-style validation. What's significant here is that OnlyFans is still popular despite the amount of free hardcore pornography being available on the internet. In my opinion, it's not just about the sex for incels. I feel they crave intimacy, connection, and recognition to mitigate against loneliness and the dread of potentially being an evolutionary dead end. However, OnlyFans is merely a simulacrum of intimacy, and is ultimately hollow. Many incels rail against it as being exploitative, and it can be likened to the Joaquin Phoenix movie, Her. Uncanny vulvas and striking vipers. It is, however, worth considering what the future holds in terms of virtual reality and sex robots, and I believe there is another talk about this topic during today's conference. The hyperrealism and supernormal stimuli effect of virtual reality has been explored in popular imagination by the dystopian drama Black Mirror, and evolutionary psychologist Diana Fleischman explores this in a very interesting article called Uncanny Vulvas. Fleischman argues that evolutionary psychology can give us insights into how sex robots are going to develop and the ramifications they'll have on society. Future robots, she says, will have all the allure of the cues of fertility in a flesh and blood woman, combined with the artificial intelligence that creates compulsive reward-directed behavior. Pornography and prostitution are popular because they arrive at sexual end goals, or a reasonable facsimile, with more clarity and lower costs than in the mating market. The average single male, paying attention to contemporary social fashions, will struggle to understand the new rules of meeting, courting, or having sex with women. Something as banal as trying to converse with a woman wearing headphones is now often considered harassment. A man's chance of mating success increase when he approaches many women, but so too do his chances of gaining reputation as sexist, exploitative, or immoral. When men get cues that women are interested in them, even if those women are mere representations, their evolved psychology leads them to less risky ways of attempting to achieve reproductive success. How many teenage boys would be able to build up the resentment to commit mass shootings or suicide if they had a beautiful sex robot or virtual reality system at home? The cues that a sex robot would provide to the evolved psychology of a previously disgruntled teenager would be, "You're achieving incredible mating success and status by staying at home and playing video games. Keep it up." This feeling of achievement from merely staying at home playing video games and having sex with a robot, of course, is a double-edged sword, and we could call it fake fitness. Why do we hate incels? James Bloodworth's insightful article, "Why Incels Are the Losers in the Age of Tinder," describes the way in which men and women uniquely hold disdain for incels. We still judge people by how much sex they have, or not in this case. We still view men who don't have sex as failures in some way. For men, calling someone an incel implies something positive, a certain sexual abundance about one's own existence. For women, it has begun to function as a put-down that ruthlessly dismisses unworthy suitors while simultaneously expelling them from the community of the good as misogynistic and creepy. It's obvious why society hates the misogynistic online abuse and the violence, but why do we hate the majority of incels for simply not taking part in a mating market that rejects them? When so much of male identity is wrapped up in the idea of competency and agency, the incel admission of incompetence is jarring to us as a society, and we find it somewhat repugnant. We are all vulnerable romantically and socially. We all face rejection and hurt in romance and relationships. Scorning incels is a projection of our own insecurities and fears. If it wasn't for random luck, we too could be alone. I wonder, is our disdain for incels an expression of an internal recognition at how superficial our sexual selection process really is? Are we hating the game by resenting the weakest players? So, what advice do I advocate? There happens to be a whole industry devoted towards helping men develop themselves to be more successful with women. However, the pickup artist industry, which coaches men how to game the system, is sneered at as superficial and sinister. Pickup artists are dismissed as teaching men how to trick women into considering them. One can imagine the exasperation of an incel who finds himself being held in scorn for his immutable incompetence and simultaneously being scolded for trying to game the system. Personally, I would still advocate the self-development route, as it will be good for someone even if it doesn't achieve the goal of getting sex or women. The problem is that as soon as you tie the explicit goal of wanting to attract women to any form of self-development, it somehow gets framed as misogynistic. Let's face it, attracting women is a pretty big motivator for a lot of people to develop themselves. I don't see why it's inherently seen as misogynistic. It seems as though women just want men to be naturals rather than trying to learn. I also think that age is an element that cannot be understated in this conversation, and many incels who struggle throughout their early 20s will find their plight gets better as they approach their 30s. So, where do we go from here? Well, it's clear that more research needs to be done into an incredibly under-researched area in academia. Dr. Leif Ottesen-Kinnear, who has previously spoke at the International Conference for Men's Issues, has called for more research in this area. There are many lenses through which we can look at the incelosphere, and I intend to focus my research around the topic. I would love to hear from you about your ideas about what I should focus my research on. Thank you, and please follow me on Twitter to keep up with my latest work. My Twitter handle is @CostelloWilliam. Thank you.